ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Claire Smith fell in love with Australian wildlife after hearing a magpie when she first stepped off the plane in Brisbane. Being from the UK, Claire had only ever heard a magpie sing like that on Neighbours. She'd grown up in the English countryside where her father was master of foxhounds, the dogs used for fox hunting. But in her new country, Claire put her energy into looking after injured animals. She began volunteering for wildlife rescue groups and caring for animals at home. At one stage, Claire had 43 baby magpies in her garage, which even she acknowledges sometimes felt like a scene from Hitchcock's The Birds. Claire went on to help create Queensland's first volunteer-run 24-hour wildlife rescue service and build the state's first dedicated kangaroo hospital. For all that and more, she has been named the 2025 Local Hero for Queensland in the Australian of the Year Awards. Hi Claire, and congratulations.
Hi Sarah, thank you so much for having me on the show.
As I say, you grew up surrounded by a very different kind of wildlife in England. Where exactly was home for you as a kid?
Well, home for me was in Gloucestershire to start with, in a really pretty little place. My father was the master of the Cotswold Vale foxhounds, and I loved nothing better than getting on my little pony, Tweedledee, and accompanying my dad to the meets.
To the meets. So tell me more about this role. It's not something I've ever thought of. What does a master of hounds do exactly?
So we actually lived on site where the hounds were kept, and plus my father's horses. And it was my dad's job to not only look after the hounds, but to also then take them out hunting 3 times a week during the season.
And when you say hounds, what sort of dogs are these? How big are they?
Okay, if you can imagine a beagle with long legs, that's a hound. They're beautiful. They're very gentle dogs, very sensitive, easy to train. And, you know, it was a tradition in the UK for hundreds of years.
And were they dogs that your dad had to exercise? I mean, what sort of responsibilities did he have in terms of caring for them day to day?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Sarah. He had to exercise them out of season, which meant taking them on walks around our country roads. And
how many at once?
He'd take at least 30 at a time. And there's no leads involved, so it wasn't 30 dogs on the end of leads. They loved my father so much that all he had to do was say stop or sit or back, and they would do exactly what he said. And I used to love, in the summer holidays, I used to love going out with my dad, walking in the mornings. So we would walk 3 times a week with the hounds so that they got their exercise.
What about feeding time? Like, how did that happen, and where did your dad get all the feed for so many dogs from?
Okay, so living in the countryside, we were surrounded by farms, and a lot of those farms were farms that had cattle, sheep. And as all farmers know, they do have deaths from natural causes. And if there was a farmer who, you know, down the paddock one morning and there's a dead cow, he would ring my father up and say, Bert, I've got a big old dead cow down in the bottom paddock. Can you come and pick her up? And so then Dad would go and pick up this cow and winch it into the truck, bring it back to the kennels, and he would butcher it for the hounds. And that's how it operated. So it prevented the farmers having to dig holes or burn dead animals, and it provided food for the hounds, yes.
Live orphaned animals would end up at your place too.
Yes, they did. My father was such a soft heart, and we had a stream, through my childhood, we had a stream of calves and lambs, chickens. We had the odd pony, goats, geese. You know, this was when he'd go out to farms and somebody would have had a dead sheep or whatever it might be. And Dad would say, what's that lamb doing over there? And the farmer would say, oh, Mother's rejected it and we just don't have the time to bottle feed it. That would come home.
And would that be part of your responsibilities as a kid? Would you help take care?
Yeah, so my sister and I learnt to bottle feed and muck out. I learnt to muck out from an early age because I had ponies from the age of 5.
For someone who didn't grow up on a farm, what exactly does muck out mean?
Oh, mucking out is mucking out the stables or wherever you might have. So our chickens had a lovely big chicken house, and so we would have to go and clean that out as well. But yeah, mucking out. It's a smelly job.
I feel I do that in my teenagers' bedrooms, but I can imagine you've got a different training in it.
Yes.
How does one become a master of hounds? Was this a profession that your father was born into?
Actually, on my birth certificate, it has my father's name, obviously, and profession is professional huntsman. So it isn't any longer because it was banned in the UK, I think in 2005. But at that point, yes, it's a profession that you go into. Before he was a master of hounds, he'd been a farmer and he'd also been a jockey. So his background was always around farming and horses.
He was training these dogs to be used in fox hunting. As you say, it was eventually something that was banned in the UK. Why one day then did he bring home a box of fox cubs? What's the story there?
The box of fox cubs. Well, I would have been about 6, 5.5, 6 at the time, and I remember him coming into the kitchen with this cardboard box rustling, and you could hear inside the box. And he put it on the floor and opened it, and there were a litter of cubs. And I think that my father just couldn't bear the thought of these cubs being left without a mum. And so he brought them home. And as far as I know, those cubs were then given to somebody who raised them. But it sort of, totally went against all principles of fox hunting that he brought this box of foxes home, and they were delightful, absolutely delightful.
Given how much he clearly loved animals and the kind heart he had towards animals in need, do you think he struggled with fox hunting as an activity, as a tradition?
I don't think he did. He'd also been master of staghounds on Exmoor and harriers, which they hunt hare. He saw it because he was a countryman and had been a farmer. He saw this as a way of keeping populations in check. And I think that's where his perspective was. It also matched his love of the countryside, his lifestyle choice. He was never driven by money. He was always driven by a passion for animals. And so as long as he could work with hounds and horses, he was happy, which went totally against the grain as far as his family were concerned when he was a young man.
What do you mean?
He came from a very, very wealthy landed family in Worcestershire. And he went to an exclusive private school and hated it. Hated it so much that one day the boys were set an essay to write about cricket. And so this was in about 1924. And my father got into serious trouble because his essay said, "Rain, stop, play." He just had no love of school. He wanted to be at home with his ponies. And the family wanted him to have a noble profession and become somebody in the community. I mean, these people had thousands of acres and were very, very wealthy. My father wanted to be a jockey, and so they disinherited him. So he got cut out of the will completely. And he went off to France, to St. Malo, and became a jockey.
And where did he learn to hunt then?
Well, when you're a farmer and you're part of that world, or were part of that world, I should say, you have the option to become part of the hunt and to pay us what they call a saddle fee, which goes to the hunt, and ride along with them. So I suppose my father's journey in that respect started going along with hunts, and he did that from a very early age on his ponies. And he had dogs that he'd trained when he was a young man. So I guess it was a natural progression to go from being a farmer in Evesham to being a master of hounds.
So this was the world that he'd been raised in and obviously broke away from to a degree, but kept up with other of those traditions. What about for you, Claire, as you became a teenager? What was your view about fox hunting?
My view of fox hunting changed completely. It did a 180. And as much as I respected my father, and as much as some of what was being said about what hunt saboteurs were saying wasn't correct either, there was still for me a moral point that hunting something wasn't right. If you wanted to control populations, then that could be done humanely, with animals being shot cleanly. But to hunt something, and it's not just hunt, they employed what were called terrier men. And the terrier men would go around and they would block up all the holes into the fox's dens so they couldn't go to ground. If the fox did manage to get to ground, the terrier men would then dig it out and send their little dogs in to bring it out. And then the fox would be thrown to the hounds live. And, it was that part of it, to me, was no part of that was sport. You can't call that a sport. That is just barbaric cruelty. So from the time I was about 15, 16, and we were still living at the kennels, and I couldn't support it any longer.
Was it something you argued with him about?
No. We never argued about it, ever. He knew that I knew as much about hunting as he did. So I was very, very well educated in that sense. I knew enough to know that some of what was being said in protest was incorrect. But he also knew that I was incredibly independent. I'd been raised to be independent and to make my own decisions. So he never argued with me about it. He never stopped me from going on hunt saboteuring escapades. But I would only do that when there was no interaction with horses or hounds, because I did not want to get involved in some of the protests where horses did get injured. And, that to me was equally as bad.
This wasn't just something you disagreed with intellectually. You did become involved, an activist against hunts and other instances of what you saw as animal cruelty. Tell me about that. How did that happen, that big change in your life?
Well, I have to tell you that when I did start getting involved with people who were protesting, my mother decided to send me away to live with my Auntie Barbara in Cheltenham, to get me away from these people of influence. So she sent me to live with Auntie Barbara in Cheltenham because she thought that was far enough away. Unfortunately, it wasn't really, because there were even more people in Cheltenham. I got a lovely summer job in a cafe, and it just happened to be where a lot of these hunt saboteur type people met. So it kind of blew the bottom out of Mum's cunning plan. I became an active hunt saboteur.
And what did that mean?
Well, that meant that I used to go out with my good friend that I had made, Sue. Sue's in her 30s. I was about 17 or 18 at the time. She was a country girl as well. But we used to go out together, and we liked to think of ourselves as hunt saboteur ninjas. So the whole aim was that nobody would ever see us, but we would lay false scent trails. We would also do things like, in England, farmers used to use bangers. They're a bit like firecrackers, and they would go off at intervals. So you light one and throw it up in a tree, and then it would go off at 2-hour intervals. They were designed to scare crows and other birds to stop them eating crops. So we used to sometimes use these bangers and throw them up so that it would, make the hounds look around and stop them in their tracks, and they'd have to regroup. But mainly we laid false scent trails.
And what do you put to do a false scent trail?
Oh my gosh, Sarah, the smell you would not believe. We used to boil up garlic, not just 1 or 2 bulbs, but bags and bags of garlic into a very strong concentrate. Then we would water it down a little bit and we'd put it in the big old lolly jars that they used to have in sweet shops, and we would bottle it, and we would do that the season before. So by the time we opened it, it was a year old. The smell was absolutely, it blew your head off.
And was that to confuse the dogs?
Yeah, it would. And it would cover the scent of any fox. It would cover the scent of anything, I tell you. And one day I ended up dropping a whole bottle of this stuff and all over me. And poor Sue, she had to drive me home, stinking the car. It really was. It made your eyes water. It was that strong. That smell lingered. It lingered.
You say that you and Sue aim to be ninjas.
Yes.
Were you ever noticed by a farmer?
Oh, God, yes. We were. I can tell you about one specific incident, which was probably the most scary of all, which was when we were out, bearing in mind hunts start very early in the morning. So if a hunt is out there at 6:30 in the morning, we were out there at 4 o'clock laying trails. And anyway, this one morning, the sun had come up. It was about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. We'd had heavy rain the night before, and we were out with the Ledbury hounds. Anyway, there's Sue and I. We're in this big paddock. We'd just finished laying this scent trail, and about 500 metres away across the paddock, we saw this farmer. He'd just got out of his Land Rover, and he was waving and shouting, and we're like, what's he saying? And he was shaking his fist, and then he went into his Land Rover and he pulled out a shotgun, a double-barrel shotgun. And then he jumped into his Land Rover, and we just thought, we've got to run. So we started running, and it's like that horrible thing when you have a dream and you cannot move your legs fast enough. They become so heavy, and it's like, oh my God, he's catching us. Because he's driving, and we're running for a gate. And then bang, there's this first shot that comes out of his driver's window.
He actually was shooting at you.
Oh, God, yes. He shot twice out of the Land Rover. And so that spurred us on even more. And then we got to this gate, this 5-bar farm gate, and we managed to jump over it, and we landed in a ploughed field. And because of the rain the previous night, it was so sludgy, and we both had Wellington boots on, and we're still going, and he's pulled up at the gate and he's got the gun out. You can hear him break the gun, and the 2 empty cartridges fly out, and we hear him reload and shut the gun, and we're running and trying to do. And I'm thinking, you know what? I've seen films where you have to run zigzag to avoid bullets, and he did another shot, and we were so lucky not to get bums full of buckshot. Thank God we didn't, but trying to get through this mud, and thankfully he did not go through the gate into this ploughed field, because he'd have wrecked it. That's why he didn't go in there, and we managed to get away. But he shot 3 shots at us.
This is high drama, Claire. I'm glad that you managed to escape and eventually make your way to the Southern Hemisphere. What first sparked your interest in leaving English countryside life and coming all the way to Australia?
I have a heritage link to Australia. I've always known about Australia. I've always known, ever since I was a little girl, I had always known about Anzac Day, because my grandfather was a naturalised Australian. He fought in the First World War in France and sailed from Adelaide to Britain and then on to France. So I had known all my life that I had this important connection. I had a lot of family here, So I'd always been curious about Australia. And the first teddy I was given as a baby, and I still have him, he's called Little Ted, and he was a little mohair koala, and he's about 4 inches tall. Most of the mohair has been loved off him, and he's only got one velvet ear now. But he's travelled all over the world with me. And I think it was just that whole growing up knowing that Australia had been very important to my maternal family. And yeah, every time I went to see Granny and my grandfather Peter, of course, Australia was, still very much a part of their world in a sense.
So you knew all about koalas. Tell me about hearing that first magpie once you landed.
Oh my God. That was the most amazing sound in the entire world that I've ever heard. I got off the plane in Brisbane and we had to walk on the tarmac. And the first sound I heard was a magpie. And I'd only ever heard magpies on Neighbours. And so I just stood there and there's people trying to get past me, pushing past me. And I just stood and listened to this beautiful sound and I thought, I'm home.
How soon after arriving did you start volunteering to care for wildlife?
Well, in that first visit, I was here for 3 weeks, and in that time I was introduced to a wildlife carer, and she had a lot of kangaroo joeys, and I got to not only meet them, but I actually got to bottle feed a joey, and that stole my heart big time. And so from that point, I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. I remember seeing kangaroos for the first time on that visit as well, in a paddock up a hill. And I moved to Australia the following year.
How did you come to be known as the Magpie Woman,
Oh,
Claire?
my God. That's when my initial foray into becoming a carer started. And I joined a wildlife group. And I started off caring for magpies. And that season, there were a lot of baby magpies coming into care. And, of course, I was new to all of this. I'd rescued lots of animals and taken them to carers, but, I'd only just learnt to look after birds. And suddenly I was getting calls left, right and centre. We've got another baby magpie, I've got 2 baby magpies. It's like, oh God, if I don't take them, who's going to take them? And I was in a wildlife group, and really and truly they probably should have stepped in, because I ended up with 43.
Where on earth did you house them all?
Well, fortunately at that time, I had a very large brick garage and also an acre of land. And so they started off in the garage, and they eventually went out into big aviaries that we built. But I was working full time. I was a diesel mechanic at the time, and I was taking baskets of baby magpies to work with me and putting them in the tea room, and then, going in periodically to feed them and clean them.
How often did they need to be fed?
We'd feed baby magpies, I'd do at least 6 feeds a day.
And what were you feeding them?
Ox heart, chopped into small pieces, rolled in something called insectivore, which is an insect powder that's specifically made for meat-eating birds.
What kind of reaction do you get from 43 baby magpies when you appear with an ox's heart wrapped in such a thing?
It's like it's a symphony. That's how I will describe it, Sarah. It is a black and white symphony of love and desperation. Please feed me, I am starving.
What's the time period of intensive care for a baby magpie?
So they grow incredibly quickly. Most babies do grow incredibly quickly. So from, a hatchling to when it starts to try and be a bit of a bigger bird and start getting out of the nest and branching and flapping its little wings, you're only looking at maybe 6 weeks. So baby bird season starts in about September. That's when we start seeing baby birds. But I would never release magpies or any other birds, to be perfectly honest, until they were as near fully grown, still juvenile. So I would never release them until March. So I would have them, if I'd got them in September, I would release them in March. That gives them a really good time to become very strong, independent, because even though you are handling them when they're babies, once they get to a stage where they are fledged, then there is no more handling, and that's when you start to remove yourself and don't have the time with them. But you want them to be able to fend for themselves in the wild. So you go through a process of that with them, and so that means removing yourself and helping them to become independent, healthy, and resilient birds.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski. You can find more conversations on the ABC Listen app or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
Claire, you mentioned that when you were caring for baby magpies, you would bring them in with you to work, to your paid job as a diesel mechanic, which is just one of the many professions you've pursued. How did you get into that?
I've always been a curious person, Sarah, and the first jobs I had here in Australia when I was allowed to work and I got my permanent residency, I was happy to take any job that anybody would give me. So I ended up working in a 2-pack painting workshop. I managed to get into management there very quickly. Then I moved to another paint shop where I managed it. So I got an offer of a job to come in and manage a diesel fitting firm, and I was able to help them and sort them out. But then I got incredibly bored because it looked so much more fun what the boys were doing out on the shop floor. So I asked if I could do an apprenticeship. And so I did. And I became a grease monkey.
How long did that take?
2 years. It should have been 4.
What kind of machines were you working on?
Big trucks. So when you sit your final exam for your apprenticeship, you have to rebuild an engine. And I smashed it. I rebuilt a Hino engine. I'd rebuilt other engines before that, but my brain is a bit like a sponge. I just soak up information, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And, you know, I didn't care that I was covered in grease and that it took ages in the shower every night to get the grease off.
Not as bad as that garlic stew you'd made back in England.
Oh, God, nothing would ever be as bad as that garlic concoction.
And so this was the workshop that you'd bring in baby magpies.
Yes.
And other animals? What else would you need to
Possums.
look after in the tea room?
I take in possums, lots of other different species of birds. Cockatoos weren't so welcome, generally because of the sound. But by that stage, my setup at home was so good, and I did have to wind down doing so many babies. So, you know, nobody should be doing 43 birds. In fact, you know, with my wildlife carers in my organisation, nobody has any more than 10 anything at one time, because it does, you can't do the animal justice.
As you were doing this volunteering, Claire, at your own home and in your own garden, what did you see was missing when it came to services caring for wild animals?
There was a distinct lack of rescue care through the night. And by that, I mean people that would go out, you know, they'd answer a phone call and go out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
And why was that so important?
We have so many nocturnal animals. You know, once I started the Wildlife Rescue Sunshine Coast Group with 3 friends, we actually had no idea how inundated we would become with calls. And, the majority of our calls came at night. We knew there was a gap. We knew nobody else was doing it. And so we set it up. And a little bit naive, really, because there were only 4 of us. We started a 24-hour hotline. Only 2 of us volunteered to do the phones. The other 2 did not want to do the phones at all because they didn't like phones and talking on the phone. So 2 of us had the phones, and we took it in turns for 14 days at a time. So I'd have it for 14 days, running 24 hours. And then my friend would have it for 14 days, running 24 hours.
How regularly would the phone ring?
Often. It could be anything from twice a day to 20 times a day. And, as you move into trauma season, which begins around about August, September time, you can double those calls.
What do you mean trauma season?
Spring. Coming into spring, you've got lots of babies being born. You've got animals on the move. So koalas are on the move because they're looking for a mate. Everything is looking to mate. And that means we have more animals on the roads. So that's why we call it trauma season.
A lot of the calls you were getting right from the beginning were related to kangaroos.
Yes.
What happens to kangaroos when they're injured? What's going on internally in a stress response?
Yep. That's a really good question, Sarah, because a lot of people don't realise that when kangaroos are in a crisis situation, like they've been hit by a car, they release huge amounts of cortisol as a stress response. Now, kangaroos are so unique. We know they're unique. They don't occur anywhere else in the world. And they have to have that response, that boost of cortisol, so that in the wild, if there is a threat, they can just bolt fast and get away. Now, when they do that, when the threat has gone, the first thing they do is look for water, and they will drink and drink and drink to flush their system because they cannot regulate their own stress responses. Like us as humans, we can suffer stress and anxiety and go into a panic, but we can come down out of that. Kangaroos can't. What happens is the cortisol just keeps running around their body at a rate of knots, and it affects the heart and other organs of the body, and they will then collapse into something called cardiomyopathy, which is basically functioning of the heart eventually ceases.
Just from that internal stress, so that they've survived the injury of the impact, but because of all of that cortisol, they have a heart attack, a cardiac arrest.
And it won't happen necessarily the same day of the injury. So if it manages to get away and isn't reported and nobody goes and checks on it, not only may it have horrific injuries, but that cortisol will keep going round and round and round in their body. And you imagine being at that level of stress, and eventually they'll have a heart attack unless they bleed out first or infection sets in or whatever it might be. But when we go to injured kangaroos and wallabies, if the injury is not too bad and it's a youngster, they can still develop cardiomyopathy. And so they have to have fluid treatment in order to flush the toxins out. And so you still may not save that animal. We're getting better and better and better at refining that, but they can't do it on their own. It has to be done manually through IV and pushing it out through their urine.
One call about a kangaroo has really stayed with you, Claire. What happened when you were called out to a main road near Caloundra?
That was really horrific, but it was also, it gave me faith in humanity at the same time. We'd been called out to a very large male kangaroo. The woman on the end of the phone was so distressed. she'd hit the roo, it had smashed in the front of her car, and it was on the bank near the road. And we arrived there, and we always make sure that the person has somebody with them or that they're okay. You know, a lot of times they're not okay because they feel so bad that they've hit an animal. Anyway, so we got prepared with our things that we needed to capture this kangaroo. Both of his legs were snapped, which is traumatic for anybody. But bearing in mind that they have all this cortisol going through the system, so they're so fired up, pain hasn't probably set in at that point. But also they can get very defensive and aggressive through fear. So we get there, and there is this large male. He would have been 50 kilos at least. So we got our gear ready, went to move towards him, and he went off down the bank. And it was a steep bank with trees on it, away from the road. And we had to follow this poor animal, and eventually he just gave up. So we're there with our big blanket. And so what you do is you put the blanket underneath the animal, a bit like a stretcher, and then you wrap it tightly so that it can't kick you, and then you carry it. Well, we were 100 metres or so down this steep bank, and we couldn't even lift the angle this kangaroo was at. We couldn't even lift him properly to get up that bank. And we were just thinking, oh my, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to have to ring for help, get some of the other guys out. It was dark, and we could see the headlights going past up above us on the road. And then there was this light just shining down, and we couldn't actually see the person. It was just a silhouette of this huge man. And down through the twiggy, branchy trees, this headlamp came down with this giant of a man. He was a truck driver, and he'd stopped on the side of the road to see if he could help. And the lady who'd hit the kangaroo told him the story. And he came down, and he came all the way down to us, and he picked that kangaroo up, and he walked up that. I'm not joking you, it was like the north face of the Eiger. It was so steep and slippy. And he carried that 50-plus injured kangaroo up that steep slope with us following behind. And he was like a knight in shining armour. And I will never, ever, I don't know what his name is, but I'll never forget that man because, you know, he was just a regular truck driver that saw a need and didn't drive off when he was told it was a kangaroo.
Was he moved as well, do you think?
Yes, he was. He was. When he got to the top before us, and he helped put the roo into the back of our vehicle. And you could see, because by that time all the blood was coming through the blanket. He'd got blood on himself because of it. And you could see he was, you know, physically shaken by the experience. And, you know, we want people to be moved by the experience of live animals, not shaken by the visibility of things like so badly injured wildlife. But it restored my faith in humanity, and he really was a knight in shining armour that night.
Can a kangaroo recover from injuries like that?
Not when both of its legs have been snapped, no. But up until 2022, there wasn't anywhere in our region to take kangaroos that could be fixed. So if it's a fracture that it's not a compound or an open fracture, there are fractures that can be fixed. But because nowhere had facilities to then carry out the rehabilitation, the rule of thumb was if a adult kangaroo comes in with injuries, it's generally put to sleep. So having seen many animals that could have been repaired and released, I decided that I was going to build a kangaroo hospital, which was a big, hairy, audacious plan. And so I set about doing it. I met a person who was already a kangaroo carer who was on property in Conondale and had a really, really, really big shed that had very little in it. And so I negotiated with them about building a hospital in their shed. You know, all that stops anybody doing anything is money. And I've never let that stop me setting out to do something and achieve it. So I did. I raised the money. I raised enough money to convert that shed into a fully functioning clinic where any vet can go to and carry out surgery, and also built quarantine yards, another yard for more rehabilitation. I had a brand new donga built for the vets to triage, and we had all the equipment that you would expect in any animal hospital.
It wasn't just the hospital. You also have an animal ambulance. What's inside an animal ambulance compared to ones for humans?
Apart from drugs, pretty much everything the same. We have cages of all different sizes, flat pack cages, soft-sided cages, depending on the patient. We have stretchers that are used for kangaroos that were provided for us by Caloundra Rotary. We do have drips for if we have a kangaroo or a wallaby that has gone into cardiomyopathy, we can do that. We can put a drip in. We have cones to put out on the side of the road and flashing lights. And we also have, things that we can use to clean initial wounds, strap wounds. It's pretty much everything that you would expect to give first aid. And the floor's cushioned, so even though, we put our baskets and carry cages on the floor, it is actually cushioned with foam rubber so that we limit the amount of vibration going through.
You did have to transport a very large animal once after you got a call from Majimba Beach. What was waiting for you there?
We didn't have an ambulance. I might say this at this time. We did not have an ambulance. We had a little SUV. So it was a turtle. So 3 of us, 3 women, and none of us are over 5'4". It's night time. We head off to Majimba Beach. There's a report of a turtle on the beach. And so when we get down to Majimba Beach with our head torches on, we can see the turtle. Oh, yeah, there's the turtle. And we were about 500 metres away. Yes, it looks quite a big turtle. But as we got closer, the big turtle became, oh my God, that's an enormous turtle. Holy shit, that's a what? Hang on a minute. That's this turtle, it was weighed eventually, and it was 150 kilos.
150 kilos.
She was a big old turtle. So we managed, I don't even know how we managed to get the blanket under this turtle, but it took quite a long time. Anybody watching us, and it was a very serious thing we were trying to do, but it should have been on Australia's funny home videos or something, because you got these 3 hobbits trying to move a 150 kilo turtle. But lucky for us, some more knights in shining armour came along. They were metal detectorists on the beach. And we just asked them to give us a hand. And bless them, they even found it heavy and hard work. And so there were 5 of us then. It took us a long time, but we achieved it. And I can tell you what, the next day, all of us, our muscles hurt beyond anything that I've ever experienced before.
Sometimes you find something quite different to what you're expecting when you arrive at a rescue site. Vets often call you about kookaburras, for instance.
Lots and lots of calls about kookaburras over the years. oh, yeah, we've got a baby kookaburra. Okay, thanks. If you can just keep it in a little box, we'll be there. Or we'll get somebody out to you in the next hour. I don't know how many times exactly this has happened, Sarah, but if I had $1 for every time it had happened, you
could buy another ambulance.
And you get to the vet practice, and God bless them for doing everything that they can do. But I really think some of them need to have a book of how to identify Australian birds. 9 times out of 10, the kookaburra is actually a baby pigeon. And because pigeons sort of have these lumpy things on their nose and on their beak, rather, and it sort of makes it look a bit bigger than it is. And I remember going to this, she was lovely. She was a lovely girl on reception. And I opened the box and I said, oh, it's a pigeon. She says, no, it's not. That's a baby kookaburra.
That's our native, that's our emblem. You'd be respectful of that baby kookaburra.
I said, honestly, I promise you. On that occasion, actually, I was able to show her a picture of a baby kookaburra because I'd got some baby kookaburras at home. And I love them dearly, but they're the ugliest things you've ever seen in your life. Nothing like a baby pigeon.
And will you take a baby pigeon, or what do you do with it?
Yeah, we take baby pigeons.
You'll take anything?
We take anything. We'll take anything.
There was another bird that you rescued, which was not what you expected it to be.
Oh,
God.
God.
Who is Squirtle?
Squirtle the bastard. Squirtle lives with me. And Squirtle has been the bane of my existence for 9 years. So we get a call, and it was a lady in Nambour, and she had got what she thought was a lorikeet, and it was stuck on the outside of her screen door. This poor lady was agoraphobic, so she couldn't go outside, and she was also afraid of birds. So she was in a big quandary. So I turn up, and I go through, and there's this bird that definitely is not a lorikeet. It's a green-cheeked conure on the outside of her screen door. So I go outside, and he lets me pick him off the door. And I said, oh, this is a pet, somebody's pet. I said, okay. I said, I'll put a notice out, and we'll put him in the paper and all the rest of it. And he had a leg band on with a number. So took the little bird home, did all the right things, advertised it, left, right and centre. Nobody ever came forward for this bird.
Was there a reason why no one came forward for this bird, do you think?
Well, I know what the reason is now. He's a complete and utter bastard.
He's
sort
vicious.
Of way? Well, to start with, he did love me quite a bit. But then he just started becoming nasty. He talks and he says things like, put your shoes on. Put your shoes on. Shut up. And, and other things that if the vicar was coming to tea, you wouldn't have the bird present. So this bird lulls me into a false sense of security. So I'll say, come on, little BB, come on, my little BB. And he'll get up onto my finger and have a cuddle. And I just think, oh, isn't that lovely? And then he will just sink his beak so far into my fingers and he just holds. And you can't shake birds because you'll break birds by shaking them. And it's like, so now I don't really touch him because I would rather pick up a wedge-tailed eagle than pick up Squirtle the bastard.
You have been involved in the rescue and rehabilitation of Aquila, the wedge-tailed eagle. Tell me that story.
It was when we had the terrible floods a few years ago, and we got a call from a lady who was moving her horses out of her paddock, and in the middle of the paddock was a little bit of a rise where the water hadn't quite got to yet. It was sort of knee-deep, and there was an eagle, a drenched wedge-tailed eagle on this little rise, and she said that it is trying to flap and get off the ground, but it can't. So luckily it was only about 15 minutes away and we just raced straight down there. The water wasn't at a height where it was dangerous for me to enter, and I walked over to this little bit of refuge, and there was the most beautiful female wedge-tailed eagle. And so I just picked her up.
How?
From behind. and then you put your arms around them. And as you're putting your arms around them to keep their wings in, you use your hands and you open them up like a pair of scissors. A bit like, imagine you're Dr. Spock doing the Dr. Spock thing with his hands. And you put that either side of their legs, and you then tip the body against you, and you hold the legs away from you. And so you've got the legs between your fingers, and the talons are facing out.
And are they the most dangerous part of an eagle?
Absolutely. Her talons were so big that she could have easily put a hole straight through my forearm, through my bones. She could go through a leg bone. But she was absolutely exhausted and soaked. And so we took Aquila home. I called her Aquila because it's Latin for eagle, and took her home. It took 3 days to dry her out. I had a triage room, and I had her on a. She was so wet. I had to warm her up slowly, and so I had her on a big perch. I needed her to be able to stretch her wings out fully, and wedge-tailed eagles have got a really big wingspan, and so she was there for 2.5 days, drying out, and she was so cold. Her beak became almost transparent when I brought her home. And then halfway through the second day, the rain had gone, it was sunny, and I took her out into one of the big aviaries and let her have some time out there. And she was incredibly gentle. You know, as long as you give these animals and birds the respect that they're due, they pick up on that when you're rescuing them or you're a carer. And on the 4th morning, we were able to take Aquila back to where she was found, and the water had started receding then anyway. And she was the most magnificent colours. Her beak was fully back to the colours it should be. And we opened the box and let her go. And she took off, and it was the most magnificent sight I think I've ever seen. And she took off, and she went up and up and up, and she sat on the thermals and just did lap after lap after lap after. And we watched her for ages. You know, she was so glad and happy to be home, and we were so honoured to have had the privilege of having her for, 3 whole days in our presence, and helping her get to the point where she could be re-released.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I so appreciate my time here with you today.
Claire Smith, who's the winner of the Queensland Local Hero in the 2025 Australian of the Year Awards. This conversation was produced by Evan Williams and recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. Carl Mulrooney is our executive producer. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au.